Okay, it is 6:30, so we will go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us. It's my pleasure to welcome you to Northern Kentucky History Hour. I'm your host for tonight, Heather Cook. I'm a sophomore at the College of Worcester studying history and political science. And when I'm not in school, I work as a visitor service associate at the Behringer-Crawford Museum. And tonight I'll be joining you live from my dorm in Worcester, Ohio. Northern Kentucky History Hour is a project of Behringer-Crawford Museum, Northern Kentucky's History Museum. We'd like to thank all of our sponsors. Behringer-Crawford Museum is supported in part by the City of Covington, Kenton County Fiscal Court, ArtsWave, Kentucky Arts Council, the Northern Kentucky Sports Hall of Fame, the Carol Ann and Ralph V. Hale Jr. Foundation, and our members. If you're not yet a member of the museum, please consider joining for access to discounts and exclusive programming. You can learn more about that as well as join at our website, which is bcmuseum.org. Before we begin, we're going to go over a few reminders for tonight. If you have a question or comment to share, please type it in the chat or the Q&A feature, and we will try to get to as many questions as possible immediately following the presentation. So let's meet tonight's speaker. Kareem Simpson is an author whose works have been published and exhibited across the U.S. and throughout the greater Cincinnati, Northern Kentucky region. He is author of Broken River, an original 60-minute stage play based on the true story of Margaret Garner, and Chronicles of a Boy Misunderstood. Simpson's work has been placed in timeless collections like the Northern Kentucky Encyclopedia and has been exhibited at Revolution's 2012 National Conference in Los Angeles and Kentucky Association of Blacks in Higher Education 2006 Annual Conference. More recently, Simpson's work can be found in local Greater Cincinnati online publications like Soapbox Cincinnati, NKY Thrives, and the River City News. Simpson is also the founder and chief imagination officer of Sparklight Creative Group, a small personal and professional development agency that inspires artists and creative entrepreneurs to build better businesses. Thank you so much for Kareem for joining us tonight. And one last thing before we get started, there is a quiz question tonight. The first respondent to enter a correct answer in the chat on Zoom or Facebook Live will win a Northern Kentucky History Hour prize, which this week is 2 passes to BCM, and you also get to win bragging rights. So tonight's question is, what was the major mode of transportation managed by the family who owned Margaret Garner? And Kareem, if you're ready, we can go ahead and get started.
Sure, thank you so much for that great introduction, Heather. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because I have a great well, I don't know great, but I think it's okay. Presentation to share with you guys, and I just see if I can get a thumbs up if everyone can see that. Yes. All right, I'll say that everyone can see that. Thank you again, Heather. My name is Kareem Simpson. As noted, I am an author, a community enthusiast, and a lover of everything creative. I am a native of Northern Kentucky. I was born in Newport, raised in Covington. My family has been in and around Covington since the early 1900s. So it's like a family reunion every time I walk out the door, which is kind of great. I wanted to, I became intrigued with the story of Margaret Garner after watching a movie called Beloved, and I saw that the movie took place, or they mentioned Cincinnati, and this is when the movie came out a couple of decades ago, and I became enthralled with the story. So that's where kind of the story begins. It's not only an African-American story. It's not just a Kentucky story. It's not just a Cincinnati story. It's an American story. And I think that's something that as we go through this presentation that we all should kind of think about, that even though the narrative is revolves around an African-American family, it is still very much an American story. So we'll go ahead and start with that. And I did let Heather know that if you guys have any questions throughout this presentation or any feedback, please feel free to put it in the chat. We'll be able to, I do kind of like having a dialogue when I do my presentations, and not just me kind of having a talking head kind of looking at you guys as well. So with that being said, we'll go ahead and get started. So Margaret, so one of the things that brought Margaret Garner's story back into kind of existence was the book published by Toni Morrison, who is an Ohio native, called Beloved. It was published in 1987 by Toni Morrison. It actually won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction in 1988, again with several other awards, as you see on the screen. The National Book Award finalist. It became a motion picture in 1998. It was actually made into an opera, a libretto, in 2005. And it was also on the New York Times Survey of Writers, and literary critics ranked it the best work of American fiction from 1981 to 2006. If you haven't read this book, I think it would be, you're missing out. I have read it several times, and it actually takes place after Margaret Garner's actual death, but I'm not going to spoil it for you. So I'm going to let you guys go ahead and dive into that book. But before we begin, I do want to give you a little bit of background of what Cincinnati was like, and Northern Kentucky was like during the time that Margaret Garner was actually alive. So Margaret Garner's the event that we're going to be talking about happened in Cincinnati in 1865. So, or excuse me, 1856. And so I wanted to kind of give you kind of like a background on what was going on. Now, during the 19th century, Cincinnati was this boom town. The Ohio River provided Cincinnati residents with many business opportunities: hotels, restaurants, and taverns. They were all over the place. They met the needs of settlers traveling westward on the Ohio rivers. Steamboats were manufactured and repaired in the city. Farmers brought their crops to the city to send down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers to New Orleans using the Miami-Erie Canal, which actually went through all of Ohio and kind of emptied out right here at the Ohio River. So Cincinnati, especially during the 1800s, the 1860s, 70s, it was a major metropolis. It was actually one of the largest cities in the United States, and because of that, or in addition to that, across the river in Newport, there was a major kind of military barracks, which kind of added to the population of the area. Now, the Newport actually received a major boost in the development in 1803. So the Fort Washington military post was moved from Cincinnati and became the Newport Barracks. So throughout all of the 1800s, or most of the 1800s, the Newport's barracks were located right there at the confluence of the Licking River and the Ohio. So right where the new development, the Oasis Event Center is right there, kind of right in that area. There was a large military presence there. So around that time, Cincinnati was also kind of a literary haven, especially for those that were involved in the anti-slavery movement. Uncle Tom's Cabin was published around this time by Harriet Beecher Stowe, which has a great connection to Cincinnati. Her father was actually the provost of Lane Seminary College that was in Walnut Hills. So she spent a lot of some time of her life, she actually spent here in Cincinnati. And she wrote this book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was one of the first things that went nationwide to actually put slavery and the ill effects of slavery into the hands, into the living rooms of folks throughout the country. We didn't have social media back then. We didn't have televisions back then. We didn't have radios back then. The printed press, so the printed word was one of those things that something tangible that individuals could hold to get information. So again, another great book. And this is one of those books that is either banned in your high school or everyone reads it in your high school. So Uncle Tom's Cabin is a big read on my list. So around this time, this is kind of, Cincinnati was a space where literaries and anti-slavery individuals, they kind of met here to talk about slavery, and it's because it was just on the other side of a slave state. So there was a lot of things going on in the 1800s, and you can see by the map here of the Underground Railroad, which is kind of an underground, or should be a network of secret stopping points where slaves would use to escape to the north. And if you can take a look, there's a big swath along the Atlantic Ocean. There's a real large swath or pathway through like Pennsylvania and the East Coast. And there's also a really large swath of travelers came right through Cincinnati. So Cincinnati along the Ohio River. So Cincinnati was a very, very popular destination for former slaves and for slaves escaping, individuals escaping slavery. And these are two abolitionists, Levi Kaufman and Salmon P. Chase, who were instrumental not only in abolition, but they were also instrumental in Margaret Garner's case. And Levi Kaufman did live here in Cincinnati, and Salmon P. Chase was the lead attorney in Ohio during the time that Margaret Garner's event happened. So we will be talking about how those two individuals were specifically involved in Margaret Garner's case, but kind of going back to what I said about how large this kind of anti-slavery movement was in Cincinnati. The antebellum Cincinnati played a large role in the abolitionist movement, partially due to its location as a major city on the free state of Ohio, directly across the river from the slave state of Cincinnati, but mostly due to the economic prowess and wealth of the opportunity that Cincinnati held, making the Queen City a major migration path for escaped slaves, as we mentioned before. This is a very familiar, if you're a Northern Kentuckian that loves walking on the river, you have seen this gentleman sitting on the bench, one of my favorite statues throughout all of Cincinnati. But James Bradley was an escaped slave who actually crossed Cincinnati, and he attended Lane Seminary College and worked with Harriet Beecher Stowe's father. He was the first individual to be entered into that college. He taught himself to read, and he became infamous when he participated in the Lane Seminary Debates, which was another item. It was nationwide, and it was another item that actually put Cincinnati on the map and put the ill effects of slavery into the hands of, into the lives of individuals throughout the country. Just a quick reminder, we're still kind of talking a little bit about what the population was like, how big it was. And by this graph, you can see that in the early 1800s, there was about nobody here. But as we go through the 20s and 40s, we quickly rose, and there's a great rise in population in Cincinnati, roughly about 1880 through the 1950s. But you see that in 1860, kind of right around where the time that Margaret Garner her event was going to happen. You can see the population of Cincinnati was roughly about 150,000 right there at 1860. All right, now we're finally get to what you guys are the crux of this of the talk. So I put a map here. So Margaret Garner was a slave. She was a slave that lived in Kentucky in a slave, or excuse me, in a on a plantation called Maplewood, which is in which was located roughly in the city of Walton, Kentucky. So so part of Maplewood still stands. This is a picture actually of the kitchen. This is the only thing that still stands of Maplewood is that kitchen. So so she lived there. She was owned by the Gaines family, who were prominent in the 1860s. The Gaines family were probably one of the most well-to-do, popular families in the area. So this, we're going to come back to this, but I just want to give you a kind of a location that how long a person would have had to walk. So Margaret Garner and her family walked from Walton, Kentucky, to the river in the night. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of kind of visual of how long it would, what she had to go through. But we're going to come back to the slide. But let's talk a little bit about the family that owned Margaret Garner. So this is actually the Gaines house, and it was the tavern house. So this was a tavern house, and I believe it is still standing. It's a destination spot for a lot of people. It was owned by Abner Gaines, and so like I said, this was a tavern and inn. And Abner Gaines was a tavern and inn owner and a proprietor. And I don't know if you guys have already guessed the trivia question. They owned the Gaines owned the Cincinnati and Lexington passageway. So the route, the carriage that took people from Cincinnati to Lexington was owned by Gaines, the Gaines family. So Abner Gaines had several children. He had 13 children. Several of them experienced some notoriety in various areas of the United States. So Margaret Garner was owned by Abner's son, John Gaines, who, and he was the original owner of Maplewood, along with Margaret Garner and her family, before being sold to his brother, Archibald. Now, the reason why John sold Maplewood and Margaret to his brother, Archibald, was because John was asked by the president to move to the Oregon Territory. Now, remember, at the time, Oregon was not a state. It was still just a territory. So he was asked by the president at the time to move to Oregon to oversee that territory. So the Gaines had a little bit of political power. So Margaret Garner was sold to Archibald Gaines, and also Maplewood was Archibald Gaines, and that's kind of where, I mean, slavery was never an easy thing to go through, but that's where a lot of things went bad and wrong with Margaret. So she decided that she wanted to escape. So her husband, so at the time that she escaped, she was married to Robert. Her husband actually lived on a neighboring plantation. So the night of the escape, it was Margaret, it was Robert, it was Robert's parents that also lived on the neighboring plantation, along with Margaret's 3 children, and she was pregnant with another child. So they all of those individuals left for Cincinnati. Okay, and this kind of part kind of always kind of gives me chills. This is actually a painting conducted by Thomas Noble Satterwhite, which is the only depiction of the event that happened when once Margaret escaped to Cincinnati, she was almost immediately apprehended by federal marshals, because at the time, federal marshals had the right, once the slave was on free land, the marshals at the time had the right to go and reclaim those slaves and bring them back. So Margaret Garner escaped to an African-American settlement in Cincinnati, and went to the house of Joseph Kite, is the name of the individual that she went to. When she was apprehended, she decided to take the life of her youngest child instead of seeing that child be forced back into slavery. And I can't imagine anyone having to make that decision. But this is the only depiction. The depiction here is a little bit, is not necessarily correct. The child that she took the life of was a baby girl. You see there's a gentleman that's on the floor there, which is not kind of accurate. But again, this is the only depiction of that horrible event. Now, this isn't anything new, where slaves would escape and they would be caught by federal marshals. And so there was a protocol. Generally, they would have to, it would be like going to jail for a couple of hours and then being released. But this was a little bit different by a couple different things. So remember, we said that there was a group of individuals from two different properties that were apprehended that night. So the officials had to figure out a couple different things, whether to charge Margaret with murder or to charge Margaret with theft. In addition, they had to figure that question out. In addition, they had to figure out who to charge. Do they charge them all together, or do they charge them separately? Because remember, there were two property owners. The group was property of two different people. So I wish I'd be able to, this is the time where I usually ask the question, what would be best for this situation? Were the abolitionists, were they gunning for her to be charged with murder, or were they gunning for her to be charged with theft? Because theft is a lesser crime and murder is a larger crime. But the thing is that the abolitionists wanted her to be charged with murder, and it's because if she was charged with murder, then the courts would have to put on record that they thought that she was a human, that the person that she took the life of was a human, and it's kind of chilling to actually think that way, that you had to. There was a time where individuals weren't considered human, and that a person would want to get charged with murder just to prove that they were human. And that's one of the things that Margaret went through, and it's one of the things that put the ill effects of slavery into the seats of the nation. This made national news. W.E.B. Du Bois wrote about this in DC, New York, Philadelphia. This was big news, this murder trial. And this trial took weeks. It wasn't just the kind of catch and release that usually happens when you when a fugitive slave, send them back. This was several weeks. It was the longest trial of its kind at the time. So those were a couple of different things, and these are some of the news clippings that came about. You see, there was they talked about the Cincinnati slave case. They talked about the arrest of a fugitive slave and the slave mother murders their child. Now, infanticide wasn't that uncommon at the time. So it was really, so when it was in the paper, it just goes to show how much larger of a story this was. Now, I told you about Levi Kaufman and Mr. Chase as before, but they had particular connections to Margaret's case. I'm going to start with Levi Kaufman. So Joseph Kite, the home of where Joseph Kite was a former slave, and he was actually a former slave on in the area where Margaret and Robert lived. So they knew where they kept correspondence with him and knew where he lived. So they immediately traveled to his house. Now, Mr. Kite actually worked for Levi Kaufman, who was an abolitionist. So we don't know like kind of where they were going to go after they left Mr. Kite's house, but it might have been to Mr. Kaufman's house, or have some connection with Mr. Kaufman. Mr. Chase, he was actually Attorney General of Ohio at the time that this case was that Margaret was captured, and it was actually his first major case. Was kind of deciding was deciding whether or not Margaret should be charged with murder or should be charged with theft. Now, this was a federal case, so it was actually decided that Margaret was charged with theft and sent back down, sent back down river. But after that decision was made and Margaret was already released to her plantation owners, Mr. Chase, as Attorney General of Ohio, came with a different decision. He decided and wanted Margaret to be charged with murder. And he actually called for Margaret to be brought back to Cincinnati to be tried for murder. So he did the right thing. But it was weeks after she had already been released back to her to the Gaines. And unfortunately, she never got the chance to stand for murder because the Gaines had already sold her to another plantation in Arkansas before Mr. Chase made his decision to bring her back to be charged with murder. And she actually died. There's a couple discrepancies or a couple different stories, but she died. She died soon after, either on the way to the plantation or at that plantation. So shoulda, woulda, coulda, right? I think it's one of those things. It was. I'm not even going to speculate. Sometimes I do speculate a little bit too much, but Mr. Chase did have that power to keep her in Cincinnati. Mr. John Joliffe was a prosecuting attorney was the defense attorney for Margaret. He actually did this pro bono. He was the prosecuting attorney for Claremont County for many, many years, but he was actually run out of Claremont County at the time because he was being a little bit too favorable to slaves and kind of lean turned being an abolitionist. So he did not continue at his post as Claremont County attorney, but he then took the Margaret's case pro bono. And now so Margaret's story is one, again, I want to kind of reiterate that this is not just a slave story. It's not just an African-American story. This is an American story because it is ingrained in our American history. And we here in Northern Kentucky and Cincinnati it's a Northern Kentucky story. whether you are Hispanic, Black, white. If you're from this region, this is a part of our history, and we have to learn from this history. And so that's why this is a picture of the historic marker that is in Mainstrasse downtown, which kind of depicts her story. Doesn't give all of it. I think it could be expanded. That's kind of why I'm actually calling for the new bridge. And it'd be great if the new bridge that we're building and that's crossing the river was the Margaret Garner Bridge. I think if there's anyone who knows anyone, maybe we can get that bridge named after Margaret Garner. But always high hopes, right? So there are several books, and I mentioned before that I've been kind of researching and following and trying to get as much information about the Margaret Garner story as possible since probably for about a little bit over 20 years. When I started, there weren't a lot of books written about Margaret Garner. Margaret Garner was, even despite there being a libretta, despite there being a movie, there still weren't a lot of books about Margaret Garner. Now there's boatloads of books about Margaret Garner, but the best ones that I found are these three. They kind of give like the backstory, not just a glossing over the story, but it kind of gives you more of the court cases and the battle that made this, that helped make this story so memorable. So, so we have the modern Medea on the left. This is actually a book that kind of transcribes the court proceedings. Which if you're a nerd like me and kind of like watching, instead of watching Law and Order one night, pick up this book and kind of go through kind of the back and forth and the political and the jurisdictional, the courtroom drama to show you what individuals thought about, and to get more information about that battle that they had, whether to prosecute Margaret as a for murder or for thievery. Belle Scott. This is actually written by the defending attorney. This gives his opinion on what was going on. More modern day, because is the Driven Toward Madness by Nikki Taylor. I think this is one of the better depictions of what kind of the modern day take of what happened, and also to talk about how that affects us as African Americans today. And I do have to give a plug to my book, Chronicles of a Boy Misunderstood, which is actually 4 stories. It does span from 1856 to the recent future. It is fantasy and fiction, but it's all wrapped around the Margaret Garner story, and it takes Margaret Garner to kind of somewhat of a mystery, but it all kind of revolves around Margaret Garner. So that was a lot of information. I don't know if I can take questions, but that's all that I had presented. Sometimes when I get involved with this, I forget like what time it is and how much time I've actually spent. Has it been 5 minutes? I've been talking for 5 minutes. Has it been like a half an hour?
Yeah, we can take some questions. But first we'd like to go over the trivia question. So that was, what was the major mode of transportation managed by the family who owned Margaret Garner? And we did have a winner, and that was S. Lester. So congratulations. You will be getting your prize in the mail. Is there anything else you'd like to say about that or explain about that question and answer?
No, I just think it goes to show you how one of the reasons that this story, that the Margaret Garner story might have been so big, is because of the family who they were connected to. Like I said, they owned the major mode of transportation from Cincinnati to Lexington. They also, it was a large family. Also, they had a family member who was handpicked by the president to to oversee one of the Oregon territory. So it just goes to show how big this story was.
And we do seem to have quite a few questions, so we'll go ahead and start with those. The first one is, do you know where the painting that you showed of Margaret Garner and her son, where that's housed at?
That should be in the museum, the Cincinnati Art Museum. It should be. If it's not, we need to let them know that they're very much missing out. So I don't know that for sure, but I would say that would be the first place that I would look.
Somebody was wondering that they had heard of a rumor, and if there's any truth to this rumor, that there was a cave under the Colonial House on the Licking River that housed slaves during the night until they could cross the Ohio.
So, yes and no. So the Colonial House is one of the oldest houses in historic Licking Riverside, and there is a tunnel underneath that leads to the river that was generally used for coal. There is no, so the reason why I say yes and no is because there's no documentation ever saying that it was, but there isn't any documentation saying that it wasn't either. So there's not a cave, but that there is a misnomer that there's a cave. There's no cave. There is a tunnel that leads from the house to the Licking River, but it was used for coal or other things.
Somebody was asking about the articles, the papers that you showed after the painting, and what newspapers those came from.
So that I don't have off the top of my head. Those were, but I do remember seeing specifically, and I mostly remember the authors' names, not necessarily the papers' names. But I don't remember what names those were. But I could, I don't know if there's an email that goes out after this. I can definitely get that information.
Yeah. Sure.
I'm just putting you on the spot. I'm sorry.
Put that. That can probably go in a release at some point.
Okay. I'm making a note to find out that information and others, because I mean I can kind of make a list of a lot of the dates and the papers that her story was in.
And then since the gangs were politically connected, somebody was asking if it is possible that they had heard of Chase's reconsideration of Margaret's charges, and if that further prompted them to sell her so far away.
Yes, definitely. That was one of the so I can't. Okay, I always say I know the answer. Like yes, there's no proof that they did. So yes, they were. It was kind of like a subpoena, if you think about that. So the family was subpoenaed to have Margaret Garner returned to Cincinnati. Most likely, they knew it was coming down the pipe. So that's one of the reasons why they sold her, or because they didn't want a runaway on their plantation any longer. I mean, that's so it's one of those things where they could. I mean, it's politics. That's all I got to say about that.
And somebody was asking about the books that you showed at the end, and what the significance of the second one in that list of three, being named Belle Scott was.
So I don't know. I did not read Belle Scott. I do know the reason why I showed it. It was because it was written by the defending attorney, and it uses aspects of the Garner's story. So that's why I showed that one.
So why did the trial still take place if she had died? Or did they not know that she had died?
So it did not take place. So I'm assuming that you're talking about when Chase subpoenaed Margaret, or the Gaines to bring Margaret back. they did not have that trial because they couldn't find her to do so. So they couldn't. She had already been sold downriver once the subpoena came, and so back then it was kind of, I mean, just the time it took for a message to get from Cincinnati to Ohio, or Cincinnati to Walton, and then to bring the person back, it was a huge ordeal. So it did not take place.
Somebody asked if you knew what happened to any of the others in her group.
So I don't. There was not any information about her husband, nor the parents of her husband, her sons. So she had four children, one who died. There was I did read where there was a like a news article that the sons they went into the army, but before they went into the army, they had a conversation with their father. But it was very, it didn't say where it was, where the conversation was. It didn't say, it was probably about 10 years later after that. So basically there's not a lot of history. There's not a lot of documentation afterwards, but now that you bring that up, I think we can find that out. So I mean, we can find where records. I think you just gave me something to do. I think I'm gonna have to find them because no one has done that yet. And there's enough historic paperwork that should be out there and available that we can find it.
And was the Garner case brought up in the seminary debates?
So that I don't know. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not remembering the time frame of the Lane Seminary debates, because it might have been before. I would want to say the seminary debates were before 1856, but I could be wrong. But I don't know. I don't know that answer.
And see if we have any questions on Facebook or not.
I do want to say that S. Lester, I have your email address, and I will email you those articles and the names.
That looks like right now that is all the questions people have gotten. Oh, somebody was asking if you know who to contact maybe about naming the bridge, because there's a lot of people after you mentioned that are really interested in that.
So yes, so the mayors of your cities, respective cities, I think might be a great, but any type of forum. There's a link that you can get feedback on the. You can go and link to a website where you can go and see all of the progression, or should be all of what the bridge is going to look like, and you can get feedback, and that way you can get feedback by saying this is whom the bridge should be named after. And I'll get you that information too, Heather.
There are a few people in the comments saying that the debates were in 1834.
Yeah, so they probably didn't mention.
Yeah, so thank you to the people in the comments for answering that. Martha Cannon, we see that your hand is up. Could you please type your question into the chat so that we can get it answered? And then there's another question, is if you knew where the baby girl was buried.
I really doubt they buried the baby girl. That's kind of sad to say, but no, I do not know. They wouldn't have given it, most likely they probably would have given it back to the property, the owner. The owner, I mean, I do not know. I do want to see, go out and see the Maplewood to see if there are any like old graves or anything like that. but before I go, I do want to give a shout out to Mary Kay Connolly, a friend of mine. Thanks.
And then someone in the chat did put a link for everybody just to make you all aware to give feedback on the naming of the bridge. So thank you for that. What was the legal effect of Chase deciding to try her for murder, since that was acknowledging that the murdered child was human?
So I think it started to set precedent, since there was not an actual trial. I don't know. I think it could have been a larger precedent if she were brought to trial and found guilty of murder. But on a level of like 1 to 10 on precedent, if she were tried and found the trial, I think it would have been a 10 as precedent, because he just made that decision. I think it was a lower precedent, like maybe a 3 or 4. Don't quote me on that. I am not a lawyer, nor am I a judge, but that's in my what I'm thinking.
It looks like right now that's all the questions people have in. So if you guys want to keep getting your questions in, thank you for all of them we've had so far. We've had tons of questions tonight. And someone was asking if you had seen the NKU presentation on the incident.
I sure have. I love Dr. Ferrante. Sure, she's a doctor, but Miss Joan, her presentation and her work, what she's done with her project, not only with Margaret Garner, but also her projects talking about her societal projects are amazing. So I have seen that.
So while people get in some more questions, because we do have a few more minutes, is there anything else you'd like to talk about or go into more detail about?
I do want to give a couple of things that I'll be doing. So if you guys want to look out for some things, I was recently named the artist in resident at the Kenton County Public Library. So I'm currently working on a novel that's going to be set in the east side of Covington. So a historically Black neighborhood, but it's going to be set in the 1980s and also have a flashback to the 1950s. So you'll really get to relive what it was like to be in Covington in the 1850s and the 1980s. There were so many things that I learned about on Madison. I mean, the buildings and the candy shops and Coppins and like what was going on in the 1950s in Covington. It blew my mind and I loved it. And I get to write about it. So that's going to be presented in June, going to be completed in June. So look for presentations there. And I recently received a grant from Arts Wave's Truth and Reconciliation grant to create a podcast that's going to be like a multi-episodic podcast about the historic places and spaces in Cincinnati and the Black narratives that went with those. So my first episode is going to be DeVue Park and its connection with the west side of Cincinnati, which was a predominantly Black neighborhood in Cincinnati. So that's going to be, the first episode will be in February. So look for that. I'll also be highlighting Union Terminal, the Cox Mansion, the Taft Museum, Beverly Hills Supper Club. And so, yeah, so that's what I'll be working on.
Sounds really interesting. We look forward to seeing those when they come out and all of that wonderful work. We'd also like to let you know we've had an overwhelming amount of comments tonight thanking you for such a wonderful presentation. So truly thank you for that. It was a great presentation. We really appreciate it.
You are very, very, very welcome. And every time I give this presentation, I'm like, well, do these people really want to hear me talk? I just get so excited about this. And I think it's a story that needs to be told, and it's our story. So thank you for giving me the opportunity. Yeah,
we love the enthusiasm. It's always great to see somebody so enthusiastic about history on these presentations. And it looks like if we don't have any more questions coming in right now, unless there's something else you want to talk about, we can wrap up a few minutes early.
I think I'm good. I love wrapping up a couple minutes early. So
So we do have some promotions from the Behringer-Crawford Museum. So Christmas hasn't ended just yet, at least not at BCM. So due to popular demand, the museum's holiday exhibits, including our holiday toy trains, Irving Berlin's White Christmas the exhibit, and our Winter Wonderland are being extended until this Sunday, January 15th, 2023. So if you haven't seen those yet, or would love to come out and see them again because they are such amazing exhibits, you have until Sunday to do that. So we hope to see you there. So you do have that extra week to see pieces from Hollywood glamour with elaborate costumes, movie memorabilia, and more from the Paramount Pictures 1954 holiday classic, White Christmas. And you can learn more about this at our website, bcmuseum.org. As a reminder, our next Northern Kentucky History Hour will be on Wednesday, January 25th, with author Kathy Witt on her Cincinnati scavenger book. She will be on location on one of the book's clue sites, the Old Kentucky Theater. She will share some of the history behind this theater that opened originally in 1939. Also, after that, we have Jamie Schworer of Schworer Beverly Hills Limousine Service presenting on February 8th. She will share the rise to stardom of Kentucky's most famous Rolls Royce, so please be sure to tune into those. Additionally, we'd like to remind you all and let you know that the museum will close to prepare for upcoming exhibits this Monday, January 16th, and will remain closed until we reopen on February 28th. So if you'd like to come see us before then, make sure you come before Sunday, check out the holiday exhibits, and then we'll see you all again after February 28th with our new exhibits. If you have a certain topic of interest that you would like to see on Northern Kentucky History Hour or are interested in presenting, please contact the museum at communications@bcmuseum.org, or you can call us at 859-491-4003. And that's all we have for this evening. So we'd like to thank all of our sponsors again and supporters of BCM. I'd like to thank our staff, trustees, and members of the Behringer-Crawford Museum. For more Northern Kentucky history through the week, you can check out our Facebook page and our YouTube channel, where you can find the latest installment of our Curator's Chats with our Curator of Collections, Jason French, and any past history hours. So please subscribe on those channels and like those videos. We really appreciate it. And until then, take care, everyone, and good night. Thank you all so much, and thank you so much, Kareem.